Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this special briefing. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl Kaiser Forum, which is a new initiative at DGAP for strategic questions, which will be launched later this year. Today's event is part of our series of morning briefings, but since we have two distinguished guests from the US today, who I will introduce in a second, we moved to the European afternoon. Last week, we looked at tariffs. Today, we want to turn to American foreign and security policy and talk about President Trump's plans on Russia and Ukraine and its implications for Europe. Over the past couple of weeks, we have seen major developments in this conflict, including ceasefire negotiations in Riyadh and a heated exchange in the Oval Office. And yet Russia continues to attack Ukraine. Its latest attack on President Zelensky's hometown left at least 18 people dead, including children, as reports have said over the past couple of days. Meanwhile, Zelensky confirmed yesterday for the first time that Ukrainian troops are operating in Russia's Belgorod border region. So what's the American strategy here? Secretary of State Marco Rubio now says that we will know, quote, in a matter of weeks, not months, whether President Putin is ready for peace. But there are no signs that Europe will play any role in this process. In fact, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called Europe pathetic for freeloading on defense in the private text messages revealed in March. Now, if 2022 was a watershed moment for the European security order, then 2025 seems like yet another major turning point. Some fear a complete breakdown of the transatlantic security order. The German Chancellor-in-Waiting, Friedrich Merz, a long-time Atlanticist, has said that it was his priority to strengthen Europe to achieve independence from the USA. It is clear, he continued, that, quote, the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. Now, have Americans really become indifferent about Europe? To better understand the logic behind Trump's course and to formulate European responses, I'm delighted to introduce a distinguished panel. First will be Dr. Emma Ashford, who is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, previously a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a research fellow at the Cato Institute. Emma Ashford is an expert on U.S. foreign policy, international security, and energy geopolitics, with regional focus on Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. She holds a PhD from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Emma. Next up will be Professor Kiron Skinner, who's the Tobey Family Chair of International Relations and Politics at Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and also a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. She served as Director of Policy Planning in the U.S. Department of State during the first Trump administration, and was also in the past an advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Dr. Skinner is an expert on President Reagan and has written several best-selling books on Ronald Reagan and U.S. political strategy. She holds a PhD from Harvard. Welcome, Karen. Last but not least, our own Rachel Tausendfreund, who's a senior research fellow for USA and transatlantic relations at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. Rachel was previously a senior fellow and editorial director at the GMF, German Marshall Fund, and she is a frequent contributor and commentator in German and international media on US politics and society, and also a frequent contributor to this briefing series. So welcome back, Rachel. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We'd like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and that it will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes or so. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and when invited to speak, keep your remarks relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting the DGAP briefing series. And now, without much further ado, over to you, Emma. Perhaps by way of starting, you could help us make sense of the most recent developments in American policy on Russia, Ukraine, and its implications on Europe. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for moving this to the afternoon. You may not see that US policy makes much sense at the moment, but I promise you it would make less sense if we were holding this at 3 a.m. for the Americans. So, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, um, the US administration is moving in a pretty concerted direction, still pushing for a ceasefire. I think there is a realization that I think was obvious pretty much to all of us up front that the idea of a 100-day ceasefire was probably a pipe dream. But I think in many ways, what we've seen over the last month or so is that the administration is genuinely serious about this, and that as a result, what they are moving towards now is probably a more realistic piece by piece approach to building some kind of ceasefire effort. So we've seen the negotiations in Riyadh. We've seen the agreement for some kind of energy infrastructure ceasefire that has actually largely held thus far. We've seen further discussions about a maritime or Black Sea ceasefire. That has not yet come to fruition, but I think there is some prospects there. And I think the hope is that if those were to work, that the administration would then be able to build on those piece by piece to move towards some kind of broader ceasefire and hopefully settlement. I think in all of this, what we've seen is that the administration is very willing to engage with the Russians and with the Ukrainians. There have been visits from Russian officials to Washington for the first time in a very long time. And so, I think there is certainly the prospect here of some kind of settlement. At the same time, I do not want to oversell this. And I think it's worth noting there are some serious constraints here. And I'll just run through four of them. I think the first constraint is that the Russians are overconfident, perhaps unsurprisingly, and I think they want a broader deal. They want to talk to the US about broader security issues and not necessarily settle the Ukraine question. That is going to be a problem, and I think we've seen steps from the administration to try and convince them that they have to talk about Ukraine first. The second problem is that I think the Ukrainians are very unclear and unhappy on this entire process. We've seen, from one week to another, Kiev basically flip from they accept what the US is doing, they're happy to work with them, over to statements that sound more like they're trying to sort of split Europe from the US.
One thing, like how is the
Sorry, can you please mute yourself? Sorry about the disruption, Emma. Please go on.
Apologies. Sorry. Yes. So I think we've seen, Ukraine is not necessarily yet willing to fully engage with this process, and they're maybe still looking for alternatives. So that is a problem. A third constraint here is that there really has not been enough coordination between the US and Europe, and I think this falls as much on the administration in terms of blame as it does on Europe. I think we've seen a variety of plans coming out of Europe that still rely too much on the US, but that's in part because there's not been enough clarity about what the administration is and is not willing to actually commit. So that is an area where it can be overcome, but work has to be done. And I think in some ways this has fallen prey to internal administration fights, right? The fact that General Keith Kellogg has been mostly sidelined means that his role as an interlocutor with the Europeans on this process is not as useful as it could be. And then a final constraint or final obstacle that I'd highlight is that I think Steve Witkoff and the administration more generally are overworked and overcommitted. Right. I think, again, visible to anyone watching, you can see they're trying to kind of do everything at once, from tariffs to the Middle East to now we're talking about Yemen and Iran and nuclear issues and also Ukraine. And so doing this all at once is going to be a seriously difficult lift. And so again, let me just say my overall takeaway here is I think, I'm cautiously optimistic something can be achieved, but there are a lot of obstacles, and there is that risk that if this does not continue to pan out, Trump, I think, could lose interest and walk away, potentially leaving Europe to pick up the pieces.
Thank you so much, Emma. Before we move on to Kiron, just a brief follow-up question. Can you understand, or perhaps from a US perspective, explain how the European irritation of not playing a larger role in the settlement of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is being perceived in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, the answer as always is that there is a division in Washington, right? I think in broader Washington, in the traditional think tank community, right, most people are aligned with European governments in feeling this irritation. They think there should be more coordination. I don't necessarily think that's where the administration is. I think the administration, as we've seen from some of these leaked texts, even from public statements, very much want the Europeans to talk about what it is they can contribute and to sort of join in this process, but they're not particularly interested in the kind of alliance coordination and reassurance that the Biden administration engaged in so much of. So I think that is just where this administration sits with regard to its policy to Europe. They're not going to engage in that kind of hand holding, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Karen, can we move on to you, and can you help us contextualize the foreign policy that Emma has laid out in the broader sort of Trumpian approach to foreign policy? And I know you've played major roles in the formulation of these policies in the past, so we are delighted to hear from you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having this meeting with our European allies. I have friends on the call who have worked alongside me, like Professor Russell Berman in the past at the State Department, and have focused much of their career on Europe. I'm optimistic about the transatlantic relationship, and because I think what Trump has been trying to do for a very long time is to really do something incredibly ambitious, which is move us into the 21st century. And that's what I actually think all of this is about. I spoke a few days ago at the Trilateral Commission's global plenary here in Washington, D.C. And my remarks here will be somewhat similar. If you go back to 1941, when when FDR and Churchill penned the Atlantic Charter, that was an incredible moment for the Anglo-American relationship and really what we would come to call the transatlantic relationship, ordering the world on paper, and then a few years later, by 45 in reality, around Western principles of freedom, freedom of navigation, democracy, individual rights, liberty, international cooperation, with the United States kind of being the organizer for the world, having taken the baton from the UK. We've been in that world for a very long time, but the geopolitical realities have changed. Somehow, bipartisan and transatlantic elites didn't really get the memo. While the U.S. continues to have something like the lion's share of global GDP, others are catching up. There's something called the European Union, which is incredibly economically robust and politically enduring, I think. We've got the Global South coming along, various attempts by the BRICS Plus, which seem to fizzle out, but the fact that it even exists is significant. And we have a changing American demographic, which I think doesn't get talked about enough. We're a very different people than we were in the middle of the 20th century. We have the increase in Hispanic population, the political maturation of much of the Black vote, more engagement from Asian Americans. Perforce means that there will be shifts in regions of the world that the U.S. focuses on. And then there's the 2016 campaign for the U.S. presidency, which I think is the background story for where we are with the Ukraine war right now and why we have an envoy that is doing double time Ukraine and Middle East. I think there are some very similar sentiments about both of those regions, starting from the 2016 campaign of Donald Trump. I was then a Pennsylvania voter, even though I'm a California person. I was at Carnegie Mellon University, and I was watching Donald Trump in my part of the world. And he was talking to former steel workers, blue collar workers. The Amish were listening in. He was talking to rural survivors, people with very limited means, people suffering in urban areas in the vast middle of America. And he was talking about the pillars of what became ultimately what I call the Trump doctrine. Every campaign operative said this is no way to get elected. You simply cannot talk about foreign policy issues to people who are dealing with, drug addiction, unemployed white males. It's just not going to make sense. Turned out it did. He talked about what we now call reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring in the economy. He talked about bringing manufacturing back and how that would rebuild communities, rebuild surrounding businesses and churches and social associations. He talked about burden sharing and he fingered NATO. And at that point in the conversation, NATO, I think, was 29 members, and only about 4 or 5, US, UK, Poland, Estonia, Greece, were meeting the Wales pledge of 2% of GDP toward mutual defense. Actually, people were listening. No presidential candidate had talked this way. He talked about the need for strict reciprocity in international agreements. He talked about the need to end endless wars. He sounded a lot like candidate Barack Obama when he talked about Iraq being the wrong war. And all of these were part of his presidential campaign. He talked about the need to return to national sovereignty, to making the nation state the core unit of analysis in the international system, then got elected, then reinforced all of these points in his first two UN General Assembly speeches, then reinforced all of these points more recently in his message to Congress. There's been a theoretical attempt by Donald Trump. I know that sounds a bit like an oxymoron, but it happens to be true, to reorder the international system to the 21st century. Enter the Biden administration, wars in Ukraine and between Israel and Hamas. Trump believes they would not have happened had he been reelected in 2020 or re-entered the White House, because he felt he had all the malign actors in a box, because he was rewriting the international order at such a pace he felt in the first term that they would not dare attempt a war. You can make that determination yourself, but that's the belief system that he has. These wars disrupt what he's trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry
And
to
that,
interrupt you there, Kiron. Perhaps I could ask a brief follow-up question to give you a chance to finish your thought.
okay.
When you talk about the reordering and the new assumptions of Trump's foreign policy, can you try to summarize those basic assumptions and the kind of order that we Europeans should expect?
Yes, and so I gave you that broader context because I don't think many people get it. This looks like he's dropping in from outer space. So if I took a moment there, I think it really is important. He wants a world where the United States has still an opportunity to be the predominant power on Earth. I think he wants to grow the zone, the democratic zone of states. And those states hopefully are the West, but the new geography he's looking at doesn't mean that it has to be geographically the West. It has to be more geographically aligned. And I think that's a big part of it. So it looks like Europe is being left behind, but I think what he's doing is trying to press Europe to return to some of those earlier principles that were embedded in something like the Atlantic Charter. I think his view is that the EU and other configurations in Europe are too collectivist, have betrayed a lot of those principles. I think it is as much about that as it is about the issue of burden sharing in war and peace. And for that reason, I think it's no surprise that Vice President J.D. Vance's first speech, the speech at the Munich Security Council, was about free speech, about one of the big pillars and principles. So I think that's what's partly going on is from a Europe standpoint, there are lots of other dynamics that Europe needs to kind of re-enter the community of free states in the way that I think Trump believes it was more than a half century ago. And I do think he is railing against the transnational globalists who believe they know better than others. And I think both on your side of the Atlantic and ours, he believes unelected bureaucrats are the biggest threat right now, prosperity and freedom, hence Doge. So that's one thing. And then I think also, and I know I'm taking a little time, Jen, but the idea of national sovereignty, of states being politically and territorially sovereign, is really, really critical. So sealing the border, why should Europeans care about that? The attempt to kind of quote unquote seal the US border, I think it's speaking to them as well about, issues of immigration and, political responsibility. I think he's challenging this notion of global citizenship.
Okay.
And so I hope this is helpful. I can go on, but does this kind of give you the context?
Absolutely, and we'll definitely come back to these aspects: sovereignty, free speech, and some of the other aspects that you mentioned, and also the larger dynamic of to what extent is this foreign policy domestically motivated as opposed to outward looking. But before we move on, I just wanted to remind everyone that please use the chat for comments and questions in the second part only, and please keep them short and serious. But now, Rachel, how does it look from the Berlin perspective? Can you make as much sense of Trump's foreign policy as Kiron has just laid out?
Yes and no. I'm going to start with actually staying on the optimistic route, because Emma was cautiously optimistic and Kiron was also optimistic. So let me also paint a semi-optimistic picture, at least to start, and then I'm going to offer a gloomier picture at the conclusion. You sort of mentioned it in the introduction, from the perspective of like Berlin and Europe answering the policy, which is what I'm going to look at first. I do think we're looking at a Zeitenwende, a changing of times that's more significant than 2022, or potentially much more significant than 2022. I mean, it wouldn't have happened without the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but I'm going to call it perception of betrayal in Berlin and many other capitals in Europe of the Trump administration this time around has really created a shock. Probably Trump is happy with this shock. Some of the other architects of the policy are also perfectly pleased with this shock. There was the sort of 1-2 punch of J.D. Vance's speech at Munich, followed by the interaction with Zelensky in the Oval Office. And this really shook European partners who had, grown up through generations of thinking of the U.S. as the main foundation of their own security and the foundation of their security thinking. And part of the problem, let's say, with European integration on the security and defense front is that most Europeans trusted Americans more than they trusted the other Europeans. And therefore, the impetus was always to work first with America, and then to the extent that that it was allowed, that it seemed conducive, you would also work with the other Europeans. And this had been a sort of consistent blockage point to European integration in security and defense, or European capacity building in security and defense, for a very long time. And even though Washington, I would argue, latest starting with the Obama administration, but I would actually say earlier than that, Washington started to change its message about what it wanted from its European partners. To be fair to Europe, in the early decades of this partnership, Washington did want to control European security desks. Washington did want to call the shots, and it was perfectly happy carrying, in exchange for that, the vast majority of the security burden. That was a deal that was okay for Washington. This became a deal that was no longer sustainable for Washington. And like I said, I would say latest Obama, but even before that, the message had started changing. And Washington was consistently saying to its European partners, you need to become, more independent and more capable. But Europeans were always afraid if we become more capable, the US might withdraw more, right? Secondly, they were sort of blocked from a good degree of strategic thinking and big spending and dramatic change, because they still believed they should build their security system around the US. So this is where you come to the potentially optimistic positive shock of this, right? You now have, Matz, who was a dyed-in-the-wool. The Christian Democrats are essentially, American parties. They were created by the Americans after World War II. So this is the most transatlantic, most pro-US chancellor you could imagine having, and he is now thinking we need to be able to defend ourselves. We need to be able to be independent. So this positive shock has led already to things that 3 years ago would have been politically impossible in Germany. And I'm talking about changes to the debt brake that leave a sort of open amount of spending on defense. And anything that looked like touching the debt brake was impossible in Germany up until this new shock. And also, we're even hearing talk about Eurobonds and a Europeanization of spending, which would have been politically impossible. So the optimistic version of this is you end up with, a version of the world sort of that Kiron outlined, where you have a US that's still engaged in Europe, but you have a significant Europeanization of NATO, where the European pillar has gotten much stronger, much more capable. And therefore, even though the US has sort of withdrawn a bit from NATO in order to focus on global challenges, NATO remains just as strong. Because the Europeans are finally compensating for their part, right? That's the optimistic vision. It's possible. It's the vision I like to hold on to when they seem a little confusing, and it's hard to see a plan in all of this. Now, I think though, one has to mention some of the other elements in this that paint a different kind of picture, where it's not clear, is the US going to be a part of NATO? To what extent is any of this security architecture sustainable, if you're looking at it from the Berlin side? And here I have to mention things like Greenland. I mean, you have a US president not mentioning once, not mentioning twice, mentioning repeatedly, sustainably, that he wants to invade a NATO country to conquer territory. And again, not saying, Greenland needs to do what it needs to do in order to be defensible, and the US is applying rigorous pressure. This sounds instead very imperialist. And it sounds like an old security order, a 19th century security order, where the big countries do what they want and the small countries, bandwagon, survive how they will. And this version of a kind of extreme neorealism is very unsettling for the Europeans. And, if we think of a US policy that's going to continue a little bit more along these lines, then forget the positive vision I just outlined. You might still have a positive result in terms of European security and defense integration and capacity building, but in a very insecure world, I don't think that's a very positive picture for Europe.
Thank you.
That's the gloom I'll touch on at the end.
Thank you, Rachel, so far. I want to invite everyone in the audience to come forward with questions and comments. And as you do, let me ask a brief follow-up question to you as well, Rachel. I know the coalition draft treaty has only just come out and is being circulated. You didn't have a chance to read it yet, so I'm not going to quiz you on it. But since you brought up Merz, perhaps you could say a few words about what you would recommend to the new German government and the new chancellor to do. Travel to Washington, have a frank conversation. What are the prospects that you see for the new German government in terms of the transatlantic relationship?
Honestly, I think my advice would be not to focus that much on the transatlantic relationship right now. Focus on the European relationship. Focus on delivering something. Focus on, on strengthening Europe, on cooperating with Europe, on working with Ukraine to make sure that they have a good bargaining position in the constellation of US, Russia, and Ukraine. And not sort of overly eagerly chase after Trump. I don't think that will get you the results you want. I also don't think you should try to antagonize Trump. But I think that Germans need to start thinking strategically. What does Germany want? What can Germany achieve? Who are the partners in this? And I would start with Ukraine because that's a really clear one. And I wouldn't start with sort of whining that Europeans are not at the table. I would start with coming up with a European plan, and that then gives Germany and Europe a sort of strong position with Ukraine and vis-a-vis Trump and
Understood. Understood. Thanks a lot. I want to give Emma and Kiron a chance to react to some of the concerns you just raised, Rachel, but I also want to pick up a first question from the audience. My colleague, Mario Baumann.
Thank you, Jan. Mario Baumann, I'm a research fellow here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. I wanted to ask a question to Emma Ashford. You said that you consider Trump to be serious about his intention to have a ceasefire within his first 100 days, which would be at the end of April. But irrespective of whether this will happen or not, about the intention, we have seen that Russia is clearly not interested in having a ceasefire. It is dragging the process. It's compartmentalizing any kind of ceasefire proposition, picking it apart. It poses conditions that effectively would cancel some of the sanctions, at least, that had been imposed on Russia following the full-scale invasion, for this massive breach of international law, and also with the intention to hamper the Russian war efforts. How much do you think Trump would be willing to sacrifice in these negotiations with Russia? And how do you think he will keep Ukraine on board? Because this is also a constraint that you formulated. So how would he square the circle?
Great, thanks.
Go ahead, Emma.
Sorry, yes. So I did not say he's looking for the 100-day ceasefire. I think I said he's serious about trying to find peace in Ukraine, but the 100-day thing is obviously not working, is not going to work out, and probably never was. In terms of the, I've heard this many times in the last 3 years that the Russians don't want to negotiate. So there's no point talking to them because they don't want to negotiate. And this is one of those things that in my line of work, it's an assumption, right? We're looking at the Russians and saying, well, they couldn't possibly want to talk because they want all of Ukraine, or they couldn't possibly want to talk because they're not willing to negotiate and they would rather get things on the battlefield. That I think is an open question. And what the Trump administration is doing that I think the Biden administration never quite got there on was basically saying, well, okay, let's see if that is true or not. Right. And so the process that we are in right now is this process of trying to figure out whether the Russians are willing to actually play ball and have a constructive negotiation or not. And I'll just say preliminarily, right, I think I see some signs on both sides, yes and no. The Russians are absolutely willing to engage in conversations. They were willing to engage on a preliminary ceasefire. And they have engaged to a lesser extent on some of the other issues, albeit with pretty high demands. That said, on the other hand, it's also quite clear that the Russians believe they're in a strong position. They are in a strong position. And so they're pushing pretty hard on things like, we want sanctions relief in exchange for a small ceasefire. So, this, I think, that is the challenge for the Trump administration, is how to try and keep things constructive while making it quite clear to the Russians that they're not going to simply just give away absolutely everything. So, I mean, I just don't see the evidence for the idea that there is no point in even trying because we cannot talk to the Russians. I think we're quite literally already in that process at the moment.
Emma, did you also want to pick up the question in the chat by Oliver Korf, who's asking about North Korean and Chinese involvement and how that makes a difference to the US?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think something else that has become clear, and I think, Kiron probably will want to talk about this as well, but something else that has become very clear in the first sort of 60, 70 days of this administration is that despite the frame of great power competition from the first time around, despite the fact that Trump clearly, views China as more important than Russia, we're not adopting some kind of global frame the way the Biden administration did, right? And I know, again, it's become very popular in the last 3 years or so in European capitals to adopt this frame of, right, an axis of authoritarians, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, they're all in this together. That is absolutely not the frame the Trump administration is bringing to play here. If anything, they are interested in peace in Ukraine, in part because they see opportunities here to stop the Chinese and the Russians and others pulling closer together and actively working together against the US. So I think that frame, which was clearly where the last administration was, we are now 180 degrees from that.
Kiron, I want to give you a chance to react to what's been said in the meantime. Perhaps especially one notion that Rachel mentioned, Greenland, and the imperialist tones that are being sensed in Europe. If you could help us to make sense of how this fits into Trump's foreign policy, but also please feel free to react to what your colleagues have said in the meantime.
Yes, I want to start by saying I really appreciate what Rachel and Emma said just now. Rachel's kind of note to the Europeans, I think, is one that would be helpful to us in Washington. Focus on Europe right now and what you can do. The daily tea leaves of what's happening in Washington, it's hard for all of us to actually follow. But, Europe is a big experiment and proposition that needs to be saved and revived and has a lot to contribute to the world. I actually think that's what Trump wants, a revived Europe, however that looks. And one of the, the difficulties I've always said with this America First idea, it's kind of maybe the wrong name, but it's, putting the national interest of your state first. Once you do that, you get a very different world, one that may even surprise Trump. What he's actually calling for is a lot of kind of political diversity in the world that he may not want to embrace once it happens. I think that is what we will see with Europe. On to the point that Emma just made, which I think is critical. This idea of great power competition gets started at the second half of the Trump first term, takes off in the Biden era. I don't think that's where Trump is. And I don't think he's in the place of imperialism as well. He is really in the space of securing the United States, hence Greenland, Panama. He's talked about taking them all: Mexico, Canada, Panama, Greenland. And I've heard a number of Americans say, we will be incredibly safe. We'll never be in a war again if we could just take all these places. So I think there's more thoughtfulness there. Trump is a showman. He does throw some big hypotheses out there to see what happens. What I think he's trying to say, I'm doing that, the national interest on steroids. I'm trying to figure out every part of the globe where I have an interest for protecting my people. And it stretches from Greenland to Panama. Pretty far places away, but we have deep interest in protecting kind of strong point defense. And no one else is going to do it. And Denmark didn't do it when it could do it. Why didn't it do it? Why is it running so fast now? To increase defense spending, to increase its physical presence, to protect Greenland. I think a lot of it's about telling Europe, get your act together because you actually can. And we'll be better partners in the future. I just see no evidence of wanting to walk away from Europe, no evidence of wanting to walk away from NATO, just wanting a revived and reimagined partnership.
Mm-hmm. I guess part of what for Europeans is so hard to understand is that the US already has two oceans on either side and fairly friendly neighbors all around. And so this emphasis on security on steroids, as you just framed it, is sometimes hard to understand. But perhaps Rachel would like to speak on that as well. And then I see another question in the chat by Arno Junke on the degree that to which the results of Minsk 1 and 2 agreements serve as a case study for Russia's willingness to negotiate. So perhaps let me give Rachel a chance to react first, and then we'll do the turns again.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think on a lot of these questions, my analysis is that one needs to separate sort of strategic analysis of a lot of the people who are advising Trump in the Trump administration in this kind of world of thinking, and Trump himself, who is, not deep in strategic papers and not particularly careful in his communication. Let's put it that way. So, there are security arguments for, as the ice melts, Greenland being, important for U.S. Security, and those are made by a lot of people who are, serious about these issues. Most of those people would also say Greenland is part of Denmark, which is part of NATO. Therefore, there's already a package of security architecture there to ensure that, Greenland stays secure. And the answer would be having negotiations with Denmark and the Greenlanders about upping the U.S. presence. And I would argue if that's the end goal, I'm not sure it's strategically smart to talk about taking them over and then in the next step up your military presence, because then it feels a little scarier for the Greenlanders. But that's just me. So I think, the confusion or the difficulty in analyzing a lot of these things is that there is a strategic level, also with the Panama Canal, a lot of goods important to the U.S. economy go through there, right? So if China were to take it over, it would be economically damaging for the United States. And I think I just mentioned the word that we haven't really mentioned, that is, I would argue, and Kiron can disagree with me, the reason for the national security on steroids is China. It's because there is, for the first time in a long time, for a lot of people in the U.S., a threat, an enemy that seems daunting and scary, right? In a way that, the USSR was in the 50s and even to the mid-60s, but then wasn't for quite a long time. And so I think this has kind of turned up the dial on security thinking in the US, and that has been a very big divide between the Europeans and the Americans, who the Europeans are not thinking in these kinds of war terms and actual sort of war threat terms about China. And that's been part of the divide. There's other reasons for the divide additionally now, but that's been something that's kind of underneath the transatlantic political divisions of the past, Biden and Trump administration. Trump won.
Thanks, Rachel. And sorry for jumping around somewhere between Greenland, Ukraine, and China, but we'll have to connect the dots. Perhaps, Emma, if you could go first on the question about the Minsk agreements, and then the question that just came in from Christoph Waldersee about Trump's approach to Europe and why he supports EU disruptive parties and movements like the Alternative for Germany. If perhaps, Kiron, that's something for you to answer after Emma.
Yeah, great. No, I think that's exactly right, because I think this just fits in with Chiron's comments earlier about the importance of national sovereignty, right? That he doesn't want a combined Europe. He wants European nations that are strong and work together. Very different thing. So on the Minsk question, I mean, look, again, I think Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 and understanding them and why they failed is incredibly important for understanding how a future settlement over this war might go. And Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 both failed because of the political realities, which caused failures on both sides to implement, and also per drafting, right? That phasing and things were not included in the treaty, which made it very difficult to push either side to actually make the changes they needed to make. And so the whole thing falls apart over time. That said, we are now living in a different world, right? So Minsk 1, Minsk 2, that prospect of broader Russian military action was there. We didn't know how the Ukrainian state would handle it. What we now know is that there is a core Ukrainian state that can be defended by Ukraine itself, and there is an area inside Ukraine that Russia now controls. That has been clarified by the military balance in this conflict, which makes that some of those political questions about federalism and things that's up in Minsk, they're far less relevant today. So, I mean, I do still think there's going to be contestation over the political side of a settlement here. But again, I mean, I think we shouldn't think of Minsk 1 and 2 failing as, well, we should never try again. Most peace deals fail, at least the first time around. So we should think about this as a process, and we should think about understanding why they failed so that this time around is better.
Thank you. This sounds like a lot of doom and gloom that peace deals always have to fail first time round, but then again, perhaps it's a realistic assumption. Kiron, if I could put this dual question to you, one by Thomas Kleiner-Brockhoff and the other by Christoph Waldersee, basically asking how to reconcile commitment to NATO on the one hand with challenging the territorial integrity of some of its members, how to reconcile being for strong Europe versus supporting movements and parties that are more in favor of disintegrating a united Europe. So how do we make sense of that?
So I think the commitment to NATO is about the issue of the EU, so I tease. And so this idea of a united Europe, I don't think that's where he is, but the transatlantic partnership expressed through NATO, I still think there's enough support within the leadership of his administration for, as expressed recently by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to keep it going, but with more equitable distribution of military commitment. So I think Trump sees that as something that can be done. Is he for the unified Europe under United Nations of Europe, so to speak, through the EU? I don't think that that's where the administration is putting its intellectual energy in trying to make that case. So I just want to be clear about that point. I do think there is some confusion about what all of this means, like support for political parties and movements in Europe that are in the MAGA space. There was recently in Europe a summit called Make Europe Great Again. I think they've done it a couple of times. There's support in Trump world for that kind of activity of political parties that are more nationalist or populist, but I don't think Trump is trying to make a big statement about how this will affect the EU or a more unified Europe. He just believes in this kind of process, frankly. And there was something Jen, you mentioned that I wanted to refer back to, and Zelensky said something on the opposite side. You've got two oceans, you're safe or you're not safe. And you don't have, neighbors menacing you. That's actually not quite right. This administration is doing something that's not being noticed so much by Europeans, and that's a pivot to the Western Hemisphere. And why would we pivot to the Western Hemisphere? Well, we do have danger there. And it's not just the Panama Canal. It is the fact that for the first time in our history, most of the nations from the Caribbean, Central in South America have democratically elected progressive or socialist regimes, and that happen to blame the U.S. for a lot of their problems. That's a national security threat. That's as important for Americans or U.S. citizens, more properly, than for European neighbors. They're not really powerful neighbors, but they will be in the future. They're headed toward 1 billion people, and we're not headed toward 1 billion people. So just on sheer numbers alone, we've got pivots to make that sometimes I think the Europeans don't understand.
Mhm.
And it is for that reason, going back to my earlier statement, I think Steve Witkoff is so important, because why is he holding two different portfolios? From the kind of Trump standpoint, they're the same portfolio: ending the war in Ukraine, ending the war between Israel and Hamas, a pivot away from Europe and the Middle East, where we've spent trillions of dollars in defense, dealing with wars, and I think they're actually seeing more together than people know.
Kiron, allow me to ask you the same question that I asked Rachel earlier about the new German chancellor. Coalition is coming together as we speak. If you were his advisor, what would you recommend him to do in the first couple of days or weeks of his chancellorship with regard to transatlantic relations?
I would go back to Rachel's comment. I want to be Rachel when I grow up. And I would say, fix Europe. Ignore Washington. Don't be in food fights with us every day. Don't try to placate.
What about you, Emma? Do you agree as well?
No, I think that's actually probably about right. Stay under the radar. I saw just this morning that the Commission has announced that they're going to insert reciprocal tariffs on the US. And, I mean, I completely understand the inclination to do that, but my sense is that simply staying unnoticed while you resolve internal security questions might actually be a more viable approach.
We haven't talked really about tariffs or trade yet, and we don't need to go into much detail, but I still want to raise just the political effects of the various policies that we've seen over the past couple of days, and also how does and to contextualize this in the broader foreign policy approach of the Trump administration. So Emma, perhaps you could tell us how this fits in from your perspective and the potential disruptions that we've seen already across the globe, but and also potential solutions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think actually it's quite helpful to think about trade policy in the same way that we thought about foreign policy during Trump's first term, right? The foreign policy during that 2016 to 2020 term was very much characterized by internal contestation, by fights over who had the president's ear, what policy would we pursue today, which direction was it going to go in. There was a lot of internal contestation. And I think this time around, what we see as foreign policy is actually much more coherent, is remarkably coherent considering everything. Trade policy is exactly the same as foreign policy the first time around. It is completely chaotic. There are at least 2, maybe 3 factions. The president himself appears to be slightly different from all of those factions. Basically everybody seems to agree that some kind of reworking of the global trade system is needed, that something needs to be done about US dollar dominance. And again, I think from my point of view, that's a slightly strange one to focus on, but there does seem to be a broad agreement on it. The question is how and how that should be pursued. And we are literally, again, seeing this right now playing out live on Fox News, right? Members of the administration going on saying different things, trying to get Trump's ear, trying to change direction here. So where I think, very settled on foreign policy, and I really think European policymakers should know that, should realize that, but I think the tariff policy is much more malleable still.
Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a sort of broad note to Emma's comments on the trade issue. I think there is one point of consistency in all of this that I'm not sure is always very clear to the Europeans. But Kiron mentioned at the very beginning, a reordering of the world. I think this is a consistent reordering of the U.S. place in the world to a certain extent. The sort of juggling of exact positions notwithstanding. But, there was a European or transatlantic security order that had the U.S. completely in the center. There was a sort of international security system that had, rules-based security system that had the U.S. completely in the center. And there was a global, financial and trade system that had the U.S. in the center. And the thought in previous U.S. administrations was, the costs and the burdens of that are worth it because it puts us at the middle of a global system. And the consensus on that has changed, partially among the American public, but also in the political class, that you have a more nationalist approach in the Trump administration, but also to a certain extent, in broader swathes of the public who think, that wasn't a good deal for the US, actually. We want to focus on our trade balances. We want to focus on our security on our borders. We want to, upholding international laws and the territorial integrity of Ukraine shouldn't be our job, right? And this is a kind of retrenchment and a renationalization of U.S. foreign policy. And to that extent, there is coherence across all of these different fields with, to underscore Emma's point, with a lot of disagreements about the details, for sure. And also some figuring out of the details on the fly.
We are already coming to an end of our 60 minutes. So by way of a concluding question, and I'll give you the chance to pick up any remaining points as well, but by way of a concluding question, if you could, I know predictions are hard, but if you could predict a sort of medium case outcome of transatlantic relations until the NATO summit later this year. So where do you see a good path until then? Looking a little bit into the future, perhaps you could each briefly comment on this. We'll go in the same direction as in the beginning, starting with Emma, then Kiron, and then Rachel, and feel free to pick up any other questions or comments that are left unanswered, and bear in mind that we have about 4 or 5 minutes left.
So something interesting that I think I noticed about this discussion and a few discussions I've had in the last week is they look very different than the ones we were having 6 months ago. I, routinely talk with Europeans about, the need for burden shifting, what a new administration, whether it was Trump or whether it would have been Harris, would do, and how, the US thinks about European security going forward. And last year, these conversations almost always boiled down to Ukraine first, Ukraine everything. And we need to deal with Ukraine first for European security. My sense is that seems to be shifting a little, and we're talking somewhat about Ukraine, but also much more broadly about Europe's ability to stand up inside NATO or not as a security actor in its own right. And I would say that is absolutely the right frame for folks to be talking about this issue in, because, something we didn't really talk about much on here, but, we know that the administration is considering whether it's going to, move troops around in various places, right? There are other places where the US is considering action, whether that's in the Middle East, whether that's some of these deployments to the border. And I do think, the Ukraine thing is front and center right now. But again, I think there's going to be a real prospect for US pullback from European security, from NATO deployments more generally, even if not from the organization. So I think it is good that these discussions are increasingly centered on the broader US-European security relationship and not just on Ukraine, which is a part of the picture.
Over to you.
So I think in the next few months, in the next 6 months, we will see a stronger transatlantic world. I don't think that the U.S. is renationalizing itself so much, pulling back from the international system. As I said earlier, I think it's trying to rewrite the order so that the U.S. can be at the center of it and be strong at home and abroad. It's a tall order, but I think that's what this is about. It looks nationalist. The vocabulary sounds that way, but I don't think the purpose is about that. It's about how can the U.S. remain a predominant power given that the way it was going, it would have bankrupted the country. I think there's been a more rigorous understanding that there are guns versus butter issues, and that we can't do everything for everybody. And so I think there's a shock system. If I can add just one quick point, I know we're on time. The unfortunate problem around the tariffs now is that they start on China, on the issue of China, and that's where the first Trump administration focused on all of its efforts on China had to do with trade. The problem with focusing on China and trade and then tariffs becoming global is that China's an issue that historically has been dealt with almost exclusively at the White House. So we now have a tariff war going on that's really moving from the White House. There is no deeper political understanding of what all this means because of the unfortunate way that we have organized our China policy, which puts everything, and China is about tariffs, and then the tariff policy all happens in the White House. One of the unfinished assignments of the first Trump term is that we never got a China strategy. We got a tariff policy and a trade policy. Now we've got a tariff policy all over the world, devoid of a larger kind of geopolitical strategy. And the State Department under Rubio isn't going to be strong enough to catch up to all of these characters. So this is to be determined and a little bit of concern.
Any final words, Rachel?
Sure. I'll be brief and sort of address one of the questions in the chat or a comment in the chat that it wasn't clear if we thought the tariffs were bad. I'm not going to put words in Emma or Kiron's mouth, although I think she just hinted that she thinks they're not perfect. Look, even if you are convinced by some arguments of some kinds of tariffs and reshoring and decoupling and measures to strengthen U.S. manufacturing, even those people don't think the way these tariffs were done is helpful and is strategically sound. And I'm gonna, with a concluding sentence, say I hope Kiron is right and I am wrong, and that the transatlantic relationship is gonna look rosy and strong in 8 months' time. But for sure, things look good right now for European action and for German decisiveness. And I look forward to reading the coalition agreement, and I hope that I find a lot of decisive decisions and energy in there.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you also to Emma and Kiron for helping us to make some sense of things and judging from both the comments and questions here in the audience and the state of affairs in general. I think we will definitely have to come back to these issues in our briefing series. For now, we are at the end of our time, but I also want to highlight that we will be back already on Friday morning, European morning that is, at our usual time, 8:30, to discuss the new German government coalition and the coalition treaty that's just come out. My colleagues will share a link in the chat, and the invitations will also go out to our regular listeners. So please feel free to register for that. But for now, let me once again thank our panelists for tuning in from across the big pond and for helping us to discuss transatlantic relationship and these important questions. We hope to see you soon again at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks you so much for joining. Bye-bye.